are now listening to an inspirational message from the Greater Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, where Dr. Michael Wesley Sr. is pastor. Please join the service in progress.
Week 3 now of this series on the life of Moses, and we find ourselves continually in the book of Exodus, the 3rd chapter. Week 1, we talked about the limitations of motherhood as we looked at Moses' birth and the circumstances of God's providence in protecting him and keeping him alive. In week 2, we talked about doing a wrong thing the wrong way. As we discussed the issue of missteps, we all make missteps in our life. And with good intentions, Moses had desired to free the people of Israel. But he took a misstep. He stepped out and he ended up committing murder. And whenever we try to do things outside of God's will, we learn great lessons that without him we can do nothing. And when we try to do it, we'll go further than we ever thought that we would. But we also learn that God can use us even when we mess up. And this morning I'd like to direct your attention, chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus. I'll just read only the first 4 verses of Exodus chapter 3. There these words are written. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn now turn aside, and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. This is the word of God for the people of God. I want to preach from the subject this morning, the burning bush. The burning bush. Now for you and I, it may be very difficult to imagine what this agricultural scene would be like. But I'm not, for application purposes, limiting our discussion to just a physical bush in a distant place. I'm more or less referencing the place where we meet God. And everybody here ought to have a place where God and you have a live and personal encounter, where God himself can reveal himself to you on a personal level. I know the church is a meeting place. I know we come with holy hands and lifted up hearts. But the truth is, rarely do many people experience God here. People like to fake and pretend and perpetrate in front. And sometimes God have to catch us in other places in order to reveal himself to us. There's so much that go on that's distracting. But I came to tell you today that there ought to be a place somewhere over the course of your life where you have the kind of experience with God that this man has in this text. Now, this is more than just a chance meeting of a man and God. This experience is about to direct and change the course of human history. God is ready to commission his man Moses, a man who has, as we saw last time, messed up and had to leave the comforts of Egypt and run away as a fugitive and ended up in the desert on the other side in a place unknown, undefined by geographical maps, in a place called Midian, and there live his life as a Bedouin shepherd. Now, in the Bible, there is a term that is spoken of that's known as the silent years. Although physically is, should I say, written is not there, but in biblical circles of people who study the word, we know that the silent years represent a period of time when there was no word from God. Most evident is the close of the Old Testament when the prophet Malachi put down his pen. There was a period of 400 years before there was a word from God again. And that was the appearance of God to Zechariah the priest to tell him that he and his wife Elizabeth was going to have a son and his name would be John. Not only was that period there as a silent period, but there was also a silent period in the Old Testament. When God last spoke in the book of Genesis, it was to Jacob, as Jacob was preparing to go down to Egypt to visit his son Joseph. And God spoke to him and told him it was okay for him to go down into Egypt, but to know that they were going to remain there for several centuries. And after that, there was no word from God. Here Moses is experiencing a period of silence. From the time he last left Egypt, he is alone in the desert, should I say, with his family, but alienated in some sense from God, thinking to himself that he probably has blown it and will never hear from God again. And for 4 decades, there has been silence. And on this particular day, Moses is a married man, and he has become a Bedouin shepherd. He has probably rehearsed in his mind over and over about Egypt and what happened 40 years ago, and probably has adjusted to life in its simplicity. On this day, he wanders looking for new pasture land to feed his sheep, knowing where every water hole is in the desert and knowing where the green pastures have been. He wanders to the backside, the west side of the desert, to the region that is known as Horeb, the mountain of God. But probably at that time, it was not known as the mountain of God. And there in the distance, probably bored to death, walking around with his sheep, looking for something that will excite him, he sees in the distance a bush that's on fire. Now that alone just would not do anything to him. Being a Bedouin shepherd, he would understand that in a desert of 110, 115, 120 degrees in the shade, that bushes burn all the time. But as he perhaps walked with his sheep and looked again ahead, periodically gazing up, he noticed that the bush is continuing to burn but is not destroyed. As he draws closer, he's talking to himself. Talks to himself and says, I'll now turn aside and see this strange phenomenon, why this bush is not being burned up. And the Bible tells us why, because the angel of the Lord was in the bush. The angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate appearance of the second person of the Godhead, who is the Lord Jesus himself. And the bush was not on fire because it was not just a normal bush. It was God himself, Christ himself in the midst. And may I just digress a moment and say, God knows how to get our attention. He knows what it takes for each one of us. And he used the scenario right there and the scene to not only reveal himself, but to teach some things. The text is tailored to teach. And so Moses turned aside and said, I'll go and see, examine this thing. And when God saw that he turned aside to see, God called him by name out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he answered just like men do when God called him by name, here am I. And God said, don't come any further. Take your shoes off. The ground you're standing on is holy ground. Now, I want to say to us this morning that the scene, this scene in which this happened, already teaches us what the words of the text will ultimately convey. First, that God was appearing, and God is appearing to Moses, and he is going to reveal himself to this man. Oh man, that's a deep truth. First and foremost, when God does reveal himself, he says, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, he says to Moses, he said, listen, I want you to understand that I am not a new God. I am not one of those gods that you brought with you from Egypt. I'm not one of those polytheistic, no living God. I am the one true God, and I have roots in history. I don't know which God you meet. But whenever I encounter one, I want to meet the one who has roots in history, who has been from the time past and who is now and who will be forevermore. And he says to Moses, he says, I am that God. And he says, secondly, not only who I am, he says, and I am concerned about my people. Listen. He says to him, he says that I have heard their cries by reason of their taskmasters, their slave owners, and I am come down to see about them and to relieve them of their suffering. Man, I don't know how that makes you feel, but just already, can you see what kind of God this could be? A God who's concerned about the cries of his people. A God who is compassionate enough to be concerned about people who are going through things that nobody else knows that they're going through. And then he says a third thing to Moses. He says to him in that situation, he says, I want to send you down to Egypt to lead my people out. Now that was what is in the essence of what I want to discuss today. But it's this circumstance that we would think that Moses should have been excited that God would want to reveal himself to him and tell him who he is and tell him about his concerns and tell him about his commission to go into the land. But instead of being excited, unfortunately, Moses did not want to hear this. This was unwelcome news to him. And may I say, it's unwelcome to us too. I mean, you got to understand, this man has been out here for 40 years. He's adjusted to his life. He's satisfied with his new manner of life. He's not being involved with people. He's doing things his own way. He's forgotten about Egypt. He's forgotten about his failures, and he's adjusted. And now here comes God. That was a disturbing experience. But God says to him, he says, listen, to teach him what kind of God he is, God helps him to understand first and foremost that he is not who he thinks he is. Most people in that day and time thought that God was transcendental. That is, he was a distant God. I laughed this morning. I said, if Marvin Gaye was here, he would be a distant lover. And that's the way some people think God as being someone who's detached and distant from the world in which he's made. But what Moses learns when God speaks to him out of the bush, in the middle of the bush, that God is not transcendent, he's not distant, he is imminent, he's present, he's right where we are. Listen, I want you to understand, God is not away somewhere. And sometimes it just disturbs me when I hear people pray, Lord, go over to the hospital. And we want to make God an errand boy. Send him. God is everywhere. He's right where you are right now. He's imminently concerned about his people and about their concerns. And then God says to Moses, he said, listen, before I tell you who I am, he said, take your shoes off. to help him to understand who he is. God is a holy God. Hello? How many know God is holy? Listen, don't you dare come up in my face. You've been walking around out here stepping in sheep stuff. Take your shoes off. The ground you standing on is holy ground. In other words, you just can't come up in my face. Oh man, I wish somebody would hear this. And you wonder why you come to church and you can't get no shout on. You come to church and you can't feel no move of the Spirit of God because you come just like you. I don't want to hurt nobody in here this morning, but some people come to church just like they left last night. Some people still got on last night clothes. And you wonder why you can't feel the presence of God. You're not reverencing him as a holy God. And when we think about God's holiness, we also associate with his holiness righteousness. But in our little limited human mind, we think of righteousness as being where we think of people who are good people who do good things. And so we think of God in those terms, but we also think that God may be one better than someone else who's good. But when we think about the holiness of God, we got to think of something else. Not only his imminence and not only his righteousness, but we also have to think about his wrath. The wrath of God is what we fear. And that's what makes us respect him, is because when we think of his holiness and we know how holy he is and how right he is, we dare not intrude upon spaces and circumstances that belong to him. I know I'm talking. Even when I was a boy, we didn't understand the holiness of God, but we had enough sense to understand when we passed by a church, we had to be careful. We passed by a church, we walk on the other side of the street. If we were using language that we didn't learn in Sunday school, we were careful. But I see people now who have no respect for God. We got to understand he's a holy God. And in the context of this process, of this conversation, of this revealing himself to Moses at the bush, God responds to two key questions that Moses asked and thereby reveals himself and reveals his name. Can I talk about that? I want to study his name. I want to bring it to your attention, because I think it's critical for your understanding of who God is and what else is going to happen in the life of Moses. Everything that the man is going to do later is going to be based upon the understanding that he walks away from in this revealing experience and his meeting with God. So that's why I want to tell you, your burning bush experience is critical. Your theology is learned. Your faith is deepened. Your understanding of the work that God is calling you to and what God expects and what kind of God it is that you represent is all based upon what God shows you in the moment of himself revealing himself to you. Wonder why you don't know? Because you maybe haven't had time to let the Lord tell you who he is. See, names mean something. In the Bible, names meant something in the Bible. People, I know I'm in a different generation now. And we call our children anything, so we don't care what we call them today. You know, I know y'all know some crazy names. They in your family too. Pookie, Nene, Riri, Stank, Little Johnny. We call them those things. But in the Bible, names meant something. Names meant something. Names sometimes had something to do with a person's origin. When a person was given a particular name, it referred to where they came from. Moses' name himself meant Moses. He was drawn out of the water. It tells his origin, where he began. Names also refer to the nature of a person. Adam, name means Adam because he came from the earth. Sometimes it had something to do with a person's appearance. Esau, name was Esau because he was ruddy, red in nature. You better know that when God has a name that he reveals in the Bible, it means something. And there, in that mountain on the backside of the desert, God reveals himself to Moses. God said to him, not only, he says, Moses, I want to send you. I'm going to send you. Not I want to. I'm going to send you down to Egypt. And I want you to tell that king down there, let my folk, let them come, let them out. And Moses raises the question, well, who am I that I should tell this man? And God answers that question. Before I give you that answer, he raises the second question. And who are you that I should tell somebody that you told me to go? And God answers both of these questions. So let me deal with the last question first. Who are you? Moses, somewhat sarcastic, rhetorical question to God. And God answers him, I am who I am. Now, that's a problem for many people because it is a word that people don't really understand. How God reveals himself to Moses. He gives him what the Jews call the most holy name of all. You got to understand this part of the Bible, the Old Testament, was written in the Hebrew language. And in the Hebrew language, they did not use vowels. So it is a 4-letter name. And the 4 letters are Y, H, W, H. Now you got to understand, it all depends on the application of how people supply vowels to those consonants as to what interpretation they'll walk away from that with. Wait, y'all not with me. In English, we use vowels. So vowels help us to spell words and therefore give words meaning. But suppose we had a 2-letter word that we had to supply our own vowels with. Let's say H and then T, and you put your own vowel in between. What would it be? Somebody might say that word means hat. Somebody else might say it means hit. Somebody else would say it means hot. When you supply your own vowel, you come up with your own interpretation. And so has it been in the theological community when people have these 4-letter words. But the word, even though people didn't even know how to pronounce it, less known understand its interpretation, it has created difficulty to know who God is. But it's not so difficult because those words, those 4 consonants, really means being. Being. Now, if you put one set of vowels to it, the being could be a great cause. He causes things to be. And in that sense, God would be revealing himself as creator. That would be a good name for him, but that's not what he's doing here. There's a more common form in which the vowels were applied. And when the more common form of the vowels were applied, then the being God is saying, I am that I am, or I will be who I will be. I know that might not grip your heart just yet, but God is saying, I am who I am by myself, independently from the creation that I made. I was not created by my creation, but I am who I am. And you can choose what interpretation you want to be, and I will be that I will be. And let me help somebody here walk a little deeper in this. What that really implies is that, first and foremost, that God is a personal God. Not only is he transcendent, not only is he imminent, not only is he holy, but God is personal. Look, now listen, come up here. He says, I am. Now you can't say I am if you are an it. Are you following me? I is a personal pronoun. And so God is assigning to himself personhood. Now you got to understand, in this day and time, people worship rocks and people worship trees and people worship things. Even in this day, people worship sports and people worship cars and people worship other things. And therefore, they don't understand who God is. You need a revelation. God says, I'm personal. I am. I am that I am. He's able to interact with human beings on a personal level. Man, that's important. You got to know who you're talking to. You got to know who you're talking about. And not only is he personal, but God says, when he says I am, God is self-existent. God says that I've been around. Nobody made me. See, you can't say that you are. You can only say that I came to be. I came to be a human in 19 whatever it was that you were born. Then you came to be. But God says, I am. I'm self-existent. I exist outside of anything that you see. And yet I'm so personal, I'm concerned about everything and everybody that you meet. Self-existent. I hung the stars. I give the names to everything that there is. I control the seasons. I control the weather. I control when people live and when people die. Nobody controls me. I am who I am. God is self-existent. Has he revealed himself like that to you? You got to be able to see that this is the kind of God that Moses is going to understand is going to be sending him somewhere. And not only is that the kind of God he is not only self-existent, but I think that God is also immutable. That is, he does not change. Man, that's good news. That's good news, man, especially if you meet some of the folk that I meet. You ever meet people, man, who got 2 faces, 3 faces, 4 faces? They one way one day and another day. You don't ever know what you're going to get.
Hope you enjoyed the broadcast. You have been listening to a message from the Greater Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, where we are reaching the world for Christ, located at 2135 Jefferson Avenue Southwest, Birmingham, Alabama 35211. For a copy of a CD or DVD, you can reach us at 205-925-5972 or visit us on the web at www.greatershallow.org for an uplifting message. Please join us for the next broadcast.